Peace be upon you. My name is Ep.3. This is far as I can tell. I had to do a lot of takes. Anyway, this is episode 2. And this is called The Prince of Darkness, The Devil and His Details. The Devil and His Details. The bulk of this information is going to come from paper 66, entitled The Planetary Prince of Urantia, and paper 67, The Planetary Rebellion. Man, just real quick, I gotta tell you, because this shit's so strange. Like, this information, this content is very strange, but I mean it in a extremely intriguing way. Like, growing up, I never really rocked with a lot of sci-fi and fantasy and things of that nature because I just like reality-based content. I'm not knocking people that do by any means, because I understand it can, stretch your imagination, this, that, and the third. But I guess I just never really got caught up in myths. Like, I've never really gravitated towards myths. Now, truth and what's real, like, my ears perk up. It's something in me that just, I go after that. I seek it. I feel it, because I want to be real out here. I want to live a real life. And so I just don't have time in this world for much else but absorbing the real. And all that to say, I think I've come across something. That's why this is called Far As I Can Tell. Like, hey, I don't know, bro, but this here, like, you seen this? That's how I'm really trying to present it. And that being said, there's a saying, like, the truth is stranger than fiction. And man, when I tell you, I think these papers, they ain't the end all be all. First off, ain't nothing that I could put in my hands gonna be the end all be all when it comes to information that we, can absorb. That goes on forever. There'll never be a book big enough for that. So I'm not saying that's what this is either. I just think it's a bomb, though, of truth. Like, they dropped this, like, hey, do what y'all will with this, but this is what it is. And we looking down from up on high. We looking at everything. We know from a real detailed standpoint what's going on your planet. But hey, do with it what you will. And man, so the thing, I had to, like, preface this video because I'm about to tell you some strange things. But it's gonna really sound familiar. And it's gonna sound familiar because all the myths, all the stories, all that folklore, a lot of that come from this. So again, I'm pulling from paper 66, The Planetary Prince of Urantia. And I'm gonna read the first couple paragraphs. And I gotta be honest with you, man, this is gonna be a series where if you missed the previous episodes, you're gonna have to catch up, because you can't just jump in this. And also, I can't keep going over everything all the time because it's too much. So, hey, if you rocking with this, you gotta start from the beginning. I'm gonna read the first couple paragraphs from paper 66, The Planetary Prince of Urantia. The advent of a nano-Nandex sun on an average world signifies that will, the ability to choose the path of eternal survival, has developed in the mind of primitive man. But on Urantia, the planetary prince arrived almost 500,000 years after the appearance of human will. About 500,000 years ago, and concurrent with the appearance of the six colored or Sangeet races, Caligastia, the planetary prince, arrived on Urantia. There were almost 1/2 billion primitive human beings on Earth at the time of the prince's arrival, and they were well scattered over Europe, Asia, and Africa. The prince's headquarters, established in Mesopotamia, was at about the center of world population. Excuse me. So, the advent of a Nanonandex sun on an average world. Basically, this planet gets planetary princes, like evolutionary planets get planetary princes sent to them at one time or another in their evolutionary status. And they're saying the prince came here 500,000 years ago, and he came with the appearance of, this is a backstory we're gonna have to get into later, and it's heavy too. All this is heavy, but this backstory involves the evolution of races and mortal man, how we got here, and it's kind of convoluted in a sense. And I don't know, it's not as, I'm talking about this stuff essentially out of all this information because this is what's most geared towards an individual's salvation. Like, I'm talking about the heavy things that might just so allow you to make it to the other side, how they tell it. So the narrative I'm kicking out of this information is some of the major points. So we'll get to the races and their evolution for sure. But for now, just know that when the Prince Caligastia came to this planet 500,000 years ago, they're saying it was about 500 million people on this planet. And the prince's headquarters was established in Mesopotamia. We're talking about 500,000 years ago. Part 1, Prince Caligastia. Caligastia was a Nanonandex son, number 9,344 of the secondary order. He was experienced in the administration of the affairs of the local universe in general, and during later ages with the management of the local system of Satania in particular. Prior to the reign of Lucifer in Satania, Caligastia had been attached to the council of the life carrier advisors on Jerusalem. Lucifer elevated Caligastia to a position on his personal staff, and he acceptably filled 5 successive assignments of honor and trust. Excuse me. Caligastia very early sought a commission as planetary prince, but repeatedly, when his request came up for approval in the constellation councils, it would fail to receive the assent of the constellation fathers. Caligastia seemed especially desirous of being sent as planetary ruler to a decimal or life modification world. His petition had several times been disapproved before he was finally assigned to Urantia. So, real quick, they're telling you him and Lucifer had history before he came down here because Caligastia served in Satania. So they already got history. This is the devil and Lucifer. And the last paragraph, they're pretty much saying he petitioned to come down to a planet to be a prince. Like, that's what he wanted to do. And it had been denied a few times. And they said something that may sound peculiar. Caligastia seemed especially desirous of being sent as planetary ruler to a decimal or life modification world. A couple things. I mentioned earlier a title in order of being they're referred to as life carriers. Very interesting order of being throughout the universe because they're the specific group of agents, spiritual beings who carry like life plasm to an evolutionary world. And however it happens, they start off life, that precious little plasm that starts it all. They're responsible for carrying it. And they, transport it and impart it as they see fit. Now, our planet, is what they refer to as a modification world, life modification world, or a decimal planet, because every so often they try some new things. This is a decimal planet on which they were trying some new things. Caligastia went forth from Jerusalem to his trust of world dominion with an enviable record of loyalty and devotion to the welfare of the universe of his origin and sojourn, notwithstanding a certain characteristic restlessness coupled with a tendency to disagree with the established order in certain minor matters. This next paragraph, all these papers are presented by different beings in the celestial realm, the spiritual realm. And they got personality. Like you can tell there is different ones, oddly enough. The tone. This was written by this, at the end of the paper, it says presented by a Melchizedek of Nebadon. So this is an order of being I was referring to, and they're very familiar with human affairs on our planet. And I say that because this is him speaking. But check the tone. I was present on Jerusalem when the brilliant Caligastia departed from the system capital. No prince of the planets ever embarked upon a career of world rulership with a richer preparatory experience or with better prospects than did Caligastia on that eventful day 1/2 million years ago. One thing is certain. As I executed my assignment of putting the narrative of that event on the broadcast of the local universe, I never for one moment entertained, even in the slightest degree, any idea that this noble Lanonandek would so shortly betray his sacred trust of planetary custody and so horribly stain the fair name of his exalted order of universe sonship. I really regarded Urantia as being among the 5 or 6 most fortunate planets in all Satania, and that it was to have such an experienced, brilliant, and original mind at the helm of the world affairs. I did not then comprehend that Caligastia was insidiously falling in love with himself. I did not then so fully understand the subtleties of personality pride. Yeah, man, it's heavy. Part 2, the prince's staff. Now, I don't know. I mean, just brace yourself. Ride this out with me. I'm trying my best to explain some strange occurrences on this planet. The prince's staff. The planetary prince of Urantia was not sent out on his mission alone, but was accompanied by the usual corps of assistants and administrative helpers. At the head of this group was Dalagastia, the associate assistant of the planetary prince. Dalagastia was also a secondary Lanonandek son, being number 319,407 of that order. He ranked as an assistant at the time of his assignment as Caligastia's associate. The planetary staff included a large number of angelic cooperators and a host of other celestial beings assigned to advance the interests and promote the welfare of the human races. But from your standpoint, the most interesting group of all were the corporeal members of the prince's staff, sometimes referred to as the Caligastia 100. Corporeal means flesh and blood. These 100 rematerialized members of the prince's staff were chosen by Caligastia from over 785,000 ascendant citizens of Jerusalem who volunteered for embarkation on the Urantia adventure. I mentioned in previous videos that our planet belongs in the system of Satania, and the capital of Satania is known as Jerusalem. And so what they're saying is that, and I also mentioned that we're ascendant beings and we're far from alone. Ascendant beings come from planets. Ascendant beings are like mortals, flesh and blood, who choose the will of the Father and they make the paradise journey. And it's a true ascent that takes a long time. And you have a lot of different levels you go through. And so these ascendant beings had already been through some levels, basically. They already passed through some mansion worlds. They were citizens in Jerusalem, which is the capital of Satania. And Caligastia, knowing that he was about to come to this planet, was going to pick a staff of people to accompany him to this planet, along with other angels. Now, none of these, as we'll see, were even from this planet, but I just had to clear that up because that's what they're saying. These 100 rematerialized members of the prince's staff were chosen by Caligastia from over 785,000 ascendant citizens of Jerusalem who volunteered for embarkation on the Urantia adventure. Each one of the chosen 100 was from a different planet, and none of them were from Urantia. These Jerusalemite volunteers were brought by seraphic transport direct from the system capital to Urantia, and upon arrival they were held in seraphimed until they could be provided with personality forms of the dual nature of special planetary service, literal bodies consisting of flesh and blood, but also attuned to the life circuits of the system. These Jerusalemite volunteers were brought by seraphic transport. Angels took these 100 from Jerusalem and transported them to our planet. And they were held, they said, in seraphimed, which again, seraphim means angel. They were held in these angels' custody until some literal bodies of flesh and blood from our planet were constructed for these beings who were here again as the prince's staff. Sometime before the arrival of these 100 Jerusalem citizens, the two supervising life carriers resident on Urantia, having previously perfected their plans, petitioned Jerusalem and Edentia for permission to transplant the life plasm of 100 selected survivors of the Andon and Fonta stock into the material bodies to be projected for the corporeal members of the prince's staff. The request was granted on Jerusalem and approved on Edentia. That's thick. That's real thick. I get it. So, before they came, the life carriers, that special order of being who deals with like life on a biological level, they chose some life plasm from 100 different human beings that were already here, because they were going to transport that, or basically inject these citizens from Jerusalem who were accompanying the prince. Yeah, man. Accordingly, 50 males and 50 females of the Andon Infanta posterity, just a side note, because it's way too much to get into, but Andon Infanta, they refer to them as like the first man and woman, in a sense, from a evolutionary standpoint. That's what they consider mankind, going back to this pair. Accordingly, 50 males and 50 females of the Andon Infanta posterity, representing the survival of the best strains of that unique race, were chosen by the life carriers. With one or two exceptions, these Andonite contributors to the advancement of the race were strangers to one another. They were assembled from widely separated places by coordinated thought adjuster direction and seraphic guidance at the threshold of the planetary headquarters of the prince. In short, they saying angels and the spirit of God guided them to meet at the prince's headquarters so that their plasm could be extracted. Excuse me. Here, the 100 subjects were given into the hands of the highly skilled volunteer commission from Avalon, who directed the material extraction of a portion of the life plasm of these Andon descendants. This living material was then transferred to the material bodies constructed for the use of the 100 Jerusalemite members of the prince's staff. Meantime, these newly arrived citizens on the system capital were held in the sleep of seraphic transport. They've been transported here from Jerusalem, the system's capital, 100 beings who are native to other planets than ours. They signed up for a job, essentially, like an adventure, like it's things to do in the universe. And they signed up for a job to come down here to help the prince build an evolutionary world. These transactions, together with the literal creation of special bodies for the Caligastia 100, gave origin to numerous legends, many of which subsequently became confused with the later traditions concerning the planetary installation of Adam and Eve. The entire transaction of repersonalization from the time of the arrival of the seraphic transports bearing the 100 Jerusalem volunteers until they became conscious, threefold beings of the realm, consumed exactly 10 days. And I didn't really say in an earlier paragraph, when they said they were held in the sleep of seraphic transport, it means like these citizens from Jerusalem were pretty much asleep in the custody of angels, seraphim, for 10 days. While this whole thing took place, it was a total of 10 days. Part 3, Dalmatia, the city of the prince. The headquarters of the planetary prince was situated in the Persian Gulf region of those days, in the district corresponding to later Mesopotamia. It ain't been right ever since. The climate and landscape in the Mesopotamia of those times were in every way favorable to the undertakings of the prince's staff and their assistants, very different from conditions which have sometimes since prevailed. It was necessary to have such a favoring climate as part of the natural environment designed to induce primitive Urantians to make certain initial advances in culture and civilization. The one great task of those ages was to transform man from a hunter to a herder with the hope that later on he would evolve into a peace-loving, home-abiding farmer. The headquarters of the planetary prince on Urantia was typical of such stations on a young and developing sphere. They always call different planets spheres a lot. The nucleus of the prince's settlement was a very simple but beautiful city enclosed within a wall 40 feet high. This world center of culture was named Dalmatia in honor of Caligastia. I'm gonna skip down a little bit again. It's part 3, the city of the prince. They just describing in short the prince's staff 500,000 years ago set up in what they were calling Dalmatia, and the actual locale is in the Persian Gulf. I'm gonna skip down. Near the prince's headquarters, there dwelt all colors and strata of human beings, and it was from these nearby tribes that the first students of the prince's schools were recruited. Although these early schools of Dalmatia were crude, they provided all that could be done for the men and women of that primitive age. The prince's corporeal staff continuously gathered about them the superior individuals of the surrounding tribes, and after training and inspiring these students, sent them back as teachers and leaders of their respective peoples. So essentially, they all really came down here to teach and essentially lift man, this primitive, like we talking 500,000 years ago. Imagine, like, if you will, what kind of man existed back then. I mean, I know it's hard for us to, hell, it's hard for us to look up out our phone, but just imagine, bro, 500,000 years ago on this same plane. He he wasn't where we are now, and the prince was sent down to teach and uplift, and as they said, all different kind of races. Part 4, early days of the 100. The arrival of the prince's staff created a profound impression. While it required almost 1,000 years for the news to spread abroad, those tribes near the Mesopotamian headquarters were tremendously influenced by the teachings and conduct of the 100 new sojourners on Urantia. And much of your subsequent mythology grew out of the garbled legends of these early days when these members of the prince's staff were repersonalized on Urantia as supermen. I'm gonna read a lot of this. The serious obstacle to the good influence of such extraplanetary teachers is the tendency of mortals to regard them as gods. But aside from the technique of their appearance on Earth, the Caligastia 100, 50 men and 50 women, did not resort to supernatural methods nor superhuman manipulations. But the corporeal staff, flesh and blood, were nonetheless superhuman. They began their mission on Urantia as extraordinary threefold beings. It's deep right here, man. It's real heavy. Like, because again, we got all these legends, I mean, everywhere dating back to man mating with beings from up on high and all types of other stuff going on, man. And this sound like, to me, far as I can tell, this what happened. So to read that part again, but the corporeal staff were nonetheless superhuman. They began their mission on Urantia as extraordinary threefold beings. 1, they were corporeal and relatively human, for they embodied the actual life plasm of one of the human races, the andonic life plasm of Urantia. And what they're saying is, yes, they are flesh and blood because they got y'all's flesh and blood as human beings. down here. So they got that for one. These 100 members of the prince's staff were divided equally as to sex and in accordance with their previous mortal status. Basically, whatever they was up on high, like if they came from their planet as a male or female or, the yin, yang, whatever, this duality that seems to exist throughout the universe, whatever they was up on high, they are down here. Each person of this group was capable of becoming co-parental to some new order of physical being, but they had been carefully instructed to resort to parenthood only under certain conditions. It is customary for the corporeal staff of a planetary prince to procreate their successors sometime prior to retiring from special planetary service. Usually this is at or shortly after the time of the arrival of the planetary Adam and Eve. Basically, what typically happens on worlds, if the prince and his staff, whenever they decide to leave, like they done got the people up to par in some sort of way and something new and greater is coming and they finna go back to wherever they came from, they tend to leave offspring. And Adam and Eve are material sons who tend to come after sometimes planetary princes. We're going to get to Adam and Eve. I want to say they next, pretty much. These special beings, therefore, had little or no idea as to what type of material creature would be produced by their sexual union, and they never did know. Before the time for such a step in the prosecution of their world work, the entire regime was upset by rebellion, and those who later functioned in a parental role had been isolated from life currents of the system. We're going to explain all that. The recreated bodies of this group were fully satisfied by a non-flesh diet. This was one of the considerations which determined their residence in a warm region abounding in fruits and nuts. The practice of subsisting on a non-flesh diet dates from the times of the Caligastia 100, but this custom spread near and far to affect the eating habits of many surrounding tribes, groups of origin in the once exclusively meat-eating evolutionary races. Now, all this was up under part one of how the prince's staff, Caligastia's staff that he brought down with him from Jerusalem, that was part one of how they're threefold beings. So it's part one of three. Two, the 100 were material but superhuman beings, having been reconstituted on Urantia as unique men and women of a high and special order. This group, while enjoying provisional citizenship on Jerusalem, were as yet unfused with their thought adjusters, and when they volunteered and were accepted for planetary service in liaison with the descending orders of sonship, their adjusters were detached. That's a little thick. So in Jerusalem, the capital of Satania, I mentioned before, we have thought adjusters. That's the fragment of spirit that the creator of all, the universal father, that's where he leaves us. And so it's a big deal. And they were detached from that spirit when they came down here for whatever reason. But they had already made certain choices to get them to that level they were at. I know it's a little confusing, but yeah, it's confusing to me too. But for whatever reason, they didn't have that thought adjusters with them when they came down here. But these Jerusalemites were superhuman beings. They possessed souls of ascendant growth. So they already had a real highly developed soul when they came down here nonetheless. During the mortal life in the flesh, the soul is of embryonic estate. It is born, they have in parentheses, resurrected. In the Morancha life, I mentioned that Morancha is very important. It is born, resurrected in the Morancha life and experiences growth through the successive Morancha worlds. And the souls of the Caligastia 100 had thus expanded through the progressive experiences of the seven mansion worlds to citizenship status on Jerusalem. So they had been in their afterlife for a long time and came a long way before they came down to this planet. In conformity to their instructions, the staff did not engage in sexual reproduction, but they did painstakingly study their personal constitutions, and they carefully explored every imaginable phase of intellectual, mind, and Morancha soul liaison. And it was during the 33rd year of their sojourn in Dalmatia, long before the wall was completed, that number 2 and number 7 of the Danite group, we're going to get into these different groups, accidentally discovered a phenomenon attendant upon the liaison of their Morancha selves, in parentheses, supposedly non-sexual and non-material. And the result of this adventure proved to be the first of the primary midway creatures. I mentioned the midway creatures before in the last episode, and as I said, they're in order of being that exists between seraphim and human beings, like the flesh. Matter of fact, if you was to reach out into the spiritual world, the first hand that's gonna grab you is a midway creature. Like that's the first, you feel me? Like they the lowest level, they the closest to us. And they came into being somehow or another when two of these people from the prince's staff had some sort of liaison that was non-sexual, but somehow produced this being, this midway creature. A midway creature, man. They it's deep, bro. Check it. This new being was wholly visible to the planetary staff and to their celestial associates, but was not visible to the men and women of the various human tribes. Upon authority of the planetary prince, the entire corporeal staff undertook the production of similar beings, and all were successful following the instructions of the pioneer Danite pair. Thus did the prince's staff eventually bring into being the original core of 50,000 primary midways. Each pair from Jerusalem produced 1,000 midway creatures at the prince's behest. These mid-type creatures were of great service in carrying on the affairs of the world's headquarters. They were invisible to human beings, but the primitive sojourners at Dalmatia were taught about these unseen semi-spirits, and for ages they constituted the sum total of the spirit world to these evolving mortals. All that was up under part 2 of them trying to explain these beings that came with the Prince Caligastia from Jerusalem. Now, part 3. The Caligastia 100 were personally immortal or undying. They're circulated through their material forms the antidotal complements of the life currents of the system. And had they not lost contact with the life circuits through rebellion, they would have lived on indefinitely until the arrival of a subsequent Son of God, or until they're sometime later released to resume the interrupted journey to Havana and paradise. So, since they came from Jerusalem, They had another form of energy circulating within their bodies when they was down here. These anecdotal complements of the Satania life currents were derived from the fruit of the tree of life, a shrub of Edentia, which was sent to Urantia by the Most Highs of Norlashadek at the time of Caligastia's arrival. Yo, they brought down a shrub from Edentia. Edentia is the capital of Norlashadek, which is our constellation. This shrub that they brought down here with them, they planted in Dalmatia, in the center of the city. And the fruit from the tree of this shrub provided them immortality, the tree of life to the prince's staff. This is how they were able to live so long. The fruit from the tree of life. These anecdotal complements of the Satania life currents were derived from the fruit of the tree of life. Okay, I read that sentence. But in the days of Dalmatia, this tree grew in the central courtyard of the temple of the unseen Father, and it was the fruit of the tree of life that enabled the material and otherwise mortal beings of the prince's staff to live on indefinitely as long as they had access to it. While of no value to the evolutionary races, this super sustenance was quite sufficient to confer continuous life upon the Caligastia 100 and also upon the 100 modified Andonites who were associated with them. As I mentioned, the 100 that Caligastia brought with him down from Jerusalem had plasma taken from human beings that were already on our planet, and it was 100 of them. And since these human beings gave them their plasma, they in turn shared with them their life current from the system of Satania. So they were able to eat from the tree of life as well. 100 of them, human beings who had this extra boost, they were able to eat from the tree of life as well. Until, this rebellion. It should be explained in this connection that at the time, the 100 Andonites contributed their human germplasm to the members of the prince's staff, the life carriers introduced into their mortal bodies the complement of the system circuits, and thus were they enabled to live on concurrently with the staff, century after century, in defiance of physical death. Eventually, the 100 Andonites were made aware of their contributions to the new forms of their superior, and these same 100 children of the Andon tribes were kept at headquarters as the personal attendants of the prince's corporeal staff. So the human beings that contributed their life plasma were pretty much, linked with the ones that they gave their life plasma to, the 100, the Prince's 100. Part 5, Organization of the 100. The 100 were organized for service in 10 autonomous councils of 10 members each. When 2 or more of these 10 councils met in joint session, such liaison gatherings were presided over by Caligastia. These 10 groups were constituted as follows. Now they go into more detail than I'm about to go into about the 10 groups for the sake of time, but you can read it for yourself. I'm just going to name these 10 groups basically in a quick about them. Number 1 was the Council on Food and Material Welfare. This group was presided over by Ang, A-N-G. All of them have like one syllable names, and that's it, whatever. This group was presided over by Ang. food, water, clothes, and the material advancement of the human species were fostered by this able core. 2. The Board of Animal Domestication and Utilization. This council was dedicated to the task of selecting and breeding those animals best adapted to help human beings in bearing burdens and transporting themselves to supply food and later on to be of service in the cultivation of the soil. This able core was directed by Bond. Again, man, that 100 that came from Jerusalem along with Prince Caligastia were divided into 10 groups, and they're here to uplift a primitive man, bro, 500,000 years ago. The third group, the advisors regarding the conquest of predatory animals. It was not enough that early man should try to domesticate certain animals, but he must also learn how to protect himself from destruction by the remainder of the hostile animal world. This group was captained by Dan. 4. The Faculty on Dissemination and Conservation of Knowledge. This group organized and directed the purely educational endeavors of those early ages. It was presided over by Fad. 5. The Commission on Industry and Trade. This council was employed in fostering industry within the tribes and in promoting trade between the various peace groups. Its leader was Nod. Nod. You're going to hear about this fool. 6. The College of Revealed Religion. This body was also slow in functioning. Urantia civilization was literally forged out between the anvil of necessity and the hammers of fear. But this group had made considerable progress in their attempt to substitute creator fear for creature fear, ghost worship, before the labors were interrupted by the latter confusion attendant upon the secession upheaval. The head of this council was Hap. I'm just going to go through these, man. The Guardians of Health and Life, they were concerned with hygiene, and they were led by Lut. That was 7. The 8th group was the Planetary Council on Art and Science. This corps was headed by Mech. 9th group was the Governors of Advanced Tribal Relations. They were pretty much involved with early man's politics. Their chief was Tut. And the 10th group was called the Supreme. Now I'm going to read about this 10th group. The Supreme Court of Trial Coordination and Racial Cooperation. This Supreme Council was directed by Van and was the court of appeals for all of the other 9 special commissions charged with the supervision of human affairs. This council was one of wide function, being entrusted with all matters of earthly concern which were not specifically assigned to other groups. This selected corps had been approved by the Constellation Fathers of Edentia before they were authorized to assume the functions of the Supreme Court of Urantia. These 10, up under the leadership of Van, V-A-N, he's another important character who's going to come up, or figure, rather. They had been specifically vetted in a way that others weren't. It's going to be important. Part 6, the Prince's Reign. I'm going to really skip over a lot of this, but again, this is paper 66. You can read for yourself. I'm going to say a couple sentences though. The degree of a world's culture is measured by the social heritage of its native beings, and the rate of cultural expansion is wholly determined by the ability of its inhabitants to comprehend new and advanced ideas. And essentially what they're going to be saying throughout paper 6 is that the prince, along with his staff, were engaged in trying to uplift human beings by introducing new concepts to them in a slow evolutionary manner. And basically, they would have people that they kind of select to come study up under them about new and better ways of living in civilization. And then once they had been thoroughly taught, like take that back to your people. And they did this with people from all over the world, and that was their purpose. And this went on for several 100,000 years. But again, it was only like, at the time, 500 million people on this planet. Part 7 is called Life in Dalmatia. And I'm gonna kind of skip through this too, but I don't know. I'll touch on a couple things. The prince's headquarters, though exquisitely beautiful and designed to awe the primitive men of that age, was altogether modest. The buildings were not especially large, as it was the motive of these imported teachers to encourage the eventual development of agriculture through the introduction of animal husbandry. The land provision within the city walls was sufficient to provide pasturage and gardening for the support of a population of about 20,000. Again, this is inside the city of Dalmatia. The interiors of the central temple of worship and the 10 council mansions of the supervising groups of supermen were indeed beautiful works of art. And while the residential buildings were models of neatness and cleanliness, everything was very simple and altogether primitive in comparison with later day developments. At this headquarters of culture, no methods were employed which did not naturally belong on Urantia. Essentially, they didn't do anything that they knew about from other worlds and introduce it here. Excuse me. Um, the definite order, nah, Yeah, the definite order of family life and the living of one family together in one residence of comparatively settled location date from these times of Dalmatia and were chiefly due to the example and teachings of the 100 and their pupils. Essentially, they had two-parent homes, like they were trying to introduce that model of the nuclear family 500,000 years ago. Kind of skipping down. The prince's staff lived together as fathers and mothers. True, they had no children of their own, but the 50 patterned homes of Dalmatia never sheltered less than 500 adopted little ones assembled from the superior families of the Andonic and Sangit races. Many of those children were orphans. Um, this is life in Dalmatia, man, and they just trying to show primitive man a better way because primitive man was a savage and it wasn't much he understood like outside of kill and eat. I'm gonna skip down to this is the final part in this particular paper. It's part 8, Misfortunes of Caligastia. In looking back over the long career of Caligastia, we find only one outstanding feature of his conduct that might have challenged attention. He was ultra individualistic. He was inclined to take sides with almost every party of protest, and he was usually sympathetic with those who gave mild expression to implied criticism. We detect the early appearance of this tendency to be restless under authority, to mildly resent all forms of supervision. While slightly resentful of senior counsel and somewhat restive under superior authority, nonetheless, whenever a test had come, he had always proved loyal to the universe rulers and obedient to the mandates of the constellation fathers. No real fault was ever found in him up to the time of his shameful betrayal of Urantia. It should be noted that both Lucifer and Caligastia had been patiently instructed and lovingly warned respecting their critical tendencies and the subtle development of their pride of self and its associated exaggeration of the feelings of self-importance. But all of these attempts to help have been misconstrued as unwarranted criticism and as unjustified interference with personal liberties. Both Caligastia and Lucifer judged their friendly advisors as being actuated by the very reprehensible motives which were beginning to dominate their own distorted thinking and misguided planning. They judged their unselfish advisors by their own evolving selfishness. I don't know, but to me, that's just so heavy, man. Like, I don't know. It's kind of like the scheming. I always think somebody's scheming on them. And it's like, no, man, that ain't it. You about to walk off a cliff. From the arrival of Prince Caligastia, planetary civilization progressed in a fairly normal manner for almost 300,000 years. Aside from being a life modification sphere and therefore subject to numerous irregularities and unusual episodes of evolutionary fluctuation, Urantia progressed very satisfactorily in its planetary career up to the times of the Lucifer Rebellion and the concurrent Caligastia betrayal. All subsequent history has been definitely modified by this catastrophic blunder, as well as by the later failure of Adam and Eve to fulfill their planetary mission. The Prince of Urantia went into darkness at the time of the Lucifer Rebellion, thus precipitating the long confusion of the planet. He was subsequently deprived of sovereign authority by the coordinate action of the constellation rulers and other universe authorities. He shared the inevitable vicissitudes of isolated Urantia down to the time of Adam's sojourn on the planet and contributed something to the miscarriage of the plan to uplift the mortal races through the infusion of the lifeblood of the new violet race, the descendants of Adam and Eve. In short, they're saying when Adam and Eve were supposed to come down here and clear some things up after this whole rebellion took place, which of course we're going to get to, and he threw salt in the game. The power of the fallen prince to disturb human affairs was enormously curtailed by the mortal incarnation of Melchizedek. We're going to get to him. In the days of Abraham, and subsequently during the life of Michael in the flesh, this traitorous prince was finally shorn of all authority on Urantia. Since Michael's been down here in the flesh, and we went over that briefly about his bestowal in the last episode, they're basically saying Caligastia has no authority on this planet whatsoever, even though he's still here, but he has no authority. The doctrine of a personal devil on Urantia, though it had some foundation in the planetary presence of the traitorous and iniquitous Caligastia, was nevertheless wholly fictitious in its teachings that such a quote-unquote devil could influence the normal human mind against its free and natural choosing. Even before Michael's bestowal on Urantia, neither Caligastia nor Dalagastia was ever able to oppress mortals or to coerce any normal individual into doing anything against the human will. This is important. The devil can never make you do anything you wanted to do, regardless. You already had spiritual protection from him. The free will of man is supreme in mortal in moral affairs. Even the indwelling thought adjuster, God's spirit, refuses to compel man to think a single thought or to perform a single act against the choosing of man's own will. And now this rebel of the realm, shorn of all power to harm his former subjects, awaits the final adjudication by the Uversa ancients of days of all who participated in the Lucifer rebellion. That's the end of paper 66, the planetary prince of Urantia. And paper 66 was presented by Melchizedek of Nebadon.